We are going to talk about career planning in STEM, and that's a big topic. And we have people from, I imagine, a pretty diverse pool of STEM fields. So we're going to try and give you a really good overview, and we'll leave with some action steps today. So everyone should leave with some quote unquote homework that you can use to really improve your standing in your career development, whether you're a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. So I'm going to start by clearing our beautiful drawings here. And then we'll start by just kind of talking about an overview of what is career development. So at the Career Center at Ball State, we've identified 4 real areas, and these kind of map to freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. So typically freshmen will explore options, sophomores will develop skills, etc. But really, I would argue that this is more of a cycle. It's something that's you're constantly going back to. Nowadays, most people don't retire from their first job. Actually, after graduation with their bachelor's, most people go through 10 or 12 career transitions after that first job. So exploring options will continue to be an important factor in most people's career development. So exploring options is being able to identify what all you can do with your skill set, and maybe even what your skill set is. A lot of times we use assessments to help with this. The next step is developing skills. So this is one, being able to further assess, like, what are you good at, what are you best at, and being able to kind of articulate and demonstrate, like, here's my ability with analytical reasoning, and here's how it maps to the career that I'm hoping to get. The next step is very important, which is build experience. So these are the things that actually add content to your resume or CV. So when you're applying, you need evidence that you have the skills. Okay, sorry about that. There was a little bit of a muting issue. You need evidence that you have the skills that you're saying that you have. So when people are looking at your resume or CV, or when you're giving kind of an overview of your experience, you need some of that stuff to really like build and demonstrate what you're capable of and good at. Further than that, building that experience will give you firsthand experience on, like, what do you like about these different career fields? Trying stuff is always the best way to really kind of explore. So all these things are really touching on each other at the same time. And then finally, make the transition is being able to comfortably and confidently transition into like full-time work or graduate school or whatever comes next for you. So it's having the questions and answers that you need in order to do that successfully. And again, it's always good to reevaluate and come back to explore options later. So I'm going to launch a poll real quick, and I should say, if you're watching this in the Whova app, you probably won't see the polls and other maybe Zoom features that we use. But in that chat feature in the Whova app, there is a link to the Zoom window if you're struggling to find it. But if you're on Zoom, you should see a poll pop up. And I'd like to know which of these following options best describes your career confidence right now. So how confident are you in knowing what you want to do? And then what part of the career development cycle that I just kind of described do you feel like you need to focus on right now? It looks like a lot of people are still voting.
So you've got 30 of you left. So let's get those votes in.
We'll give it just a couple more seconds. Hopefully we can get a few more votes in here. Okay, there come a few. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling, but hopefully everyone gets a chance to participate in future things if you didn't for this one. So you should be seeing the results here. So some of us are already super confident and have some experience, and that's awesome. That's kind of where we want to be eventually, but there's no pressure to be there right away, right? Being pretty confident, but not having firsthand experience. So a good next step would be to build some additional experience. This is actually a pretty common place to be for college students. So you know your major, but you're not sure after that. And I would challenge people to think that that's actually quite a bit that you have developed and figured out. If you already know kind of your major, even kind of that vague direction, you probably have already done a lot of groundwork on really understanding kind of what you like and what you're interested in. And it looks like most of us are going to be interested in developing skills right now, but we're kind of on each of these topics here. Okay, so I'd like you to find the annotate tool again. And what I'd like everyone to do is find the text on the annotate tool, or you can draw if you're on a tablet or have a touch screen, or just want to use your mouse, I guess. But what are your strengths? What are you best at? Give me a short answer to that by just kind of annotating something on this blank screen. And if you've never contemplated the question, what are you best at, which I think most of us probably haven't thought about that as much as we should, this is a really good chance to really evaluate what are you best at? What are some of your skills? What are your big talent areas?
So for those of you that walked in later, and if you go towards the top, it says you are viewing Dylan Wagner's screen, view options. There should be an annotate tool. You just click on that annotate, and then you should be able to click on text. And then you'll be able to get in there.
See? It's just calling out. How did you do that? Please don't do that.
I see the start of a few answers coming in here. And if anyone wants to unmute themselves and share anything or put anything in the chat, that would also be a good way to share. And also feel free to ask questions as we go. So independent, maybe working independently. I think I saw someone trying to put in good at experimenting. So maybe good at problem solving, trial and error, analytics, self-motivated. Great. So we have a few skills that are on here. And the next thing I would like you to think about, and we'll try this annotation tool again here, but I'd like you to think about what is your career goal? So undecided is also a valid option, but I'd like us to share some of those things that we're thinking about. And I think there's value in that because if you're wondering, what can I do with this major? What are some career goals? Starting with your peers is a really good place to start. I'm also just kind of interested to see where we're at here. So annotate some of your career goals here if you haven't already. Science policy, cool. Anyone else? And again, feel free to drop those into the chat. I have the chat open here. Okay, farm school or medical school, researcher. Developing infrastructure, great. Is anyone in that undecided camp? Engineering technology, financial stability, that's a good goal. Okay. PH, I'm assuming that's going to be PhD. Looks like a lot of people in the chat are indicating they're interested in research. Going a faculty route. Okay, so we'll clear that again. And what I'd like to move on to now, so we've kind of hit on this idea of exploring some options just a little bit in terms of kind of feeling out what are you good at and what careers might those match up with. So this will be the last time we use the annotation tool, so bear with me one more time. But I'd like you to put a little star in whatever quadrant, or a heart, a stamp, or a little mark, or whatever, in whatever quadrant you feel like you're in. So red means that you don't necessarily have a clear picture of what your skills or goals are, and green means that you have that pretty much figured out. So if you're pretty confident in what you're good at, but you're not really sure what career aligns with that, you would put a star or stamp in that little lower left quadrant. And if you're already super confident about both of those things, good for you, you'll be in that lower right quadrant. Okay, I don't see anyone in that lower right quadrant yet, which is okay. Takes a lot of work to be in that quadrant. Okay, thanks for everyone who put a little mark in there. So I'll leave the annotations up for a minute as I go through this, but basically I'll give you a quick kind of tip for each quadrant you might be in. And even though no one is on that bottom right, we'll still hit on that one. So if you're not sure what your skills or goals are, a good place to start is just kind of by self-reflecting. So start with some big questions, maybe even the questions that we already talked about, like what are you best at? What's your kind of personal mission? What difference do you want to make? A lot of people will start by saying, oh, you need to figure out what you're passionate about. But in order to do that, you need to kind of reflect, get to know yourself, and then also try some stuff. So don't feel like you have to just kind of sit and come up with all the answers. This is a gradual and iterative process. And a good place to start is just by looking at your hobbies. What things get you energized? What things get you engaged and focused? And then what kind of gets you in the zone? What gets you really kind of focused and you don't notice the passing of time when you're doing it? So if you know what your career goal is, but you're not sure what skills are required or what skills you have, you can assess and you can also start researching that career. So I'll tell you a few ways here in a minute to very specifically, if you want to be a researcher, but you're not sure what skills are required, you can find that information. And then you can also use like strengths assessments or skills assessments to figure out what are you good at? How can you answer that question? What are you best at? And will this job give you a chance to do that all the time? If you know what your skills are, but aren't sure what career lines up, well, you can research. So you can start looking at job boards and maybe using the things that you're good at as keywords or search terms. And then you can also use other occupational research sites. And I'll give you at least one example of that here on the next slide. And then finally, if you're in the position where you have both figured out, you can always continue to build experience so that you are more comfortable and able to make that argument that much more clearly when you are applying for jobs or graduate school. And no matter what quadrant you're in, like I said, it's always good to try stuff. So building experience, figuring things out, doing that experimentation is really important. I mean, you're all STEM people, you probably know and respect the scientific method. Well, your career development really is no different. You have to get in there and kind of try some stuff, see if you like it. And every time you build experience, that's going to give you more information, not only about the internship you did or research that you did, but something adjacent to it. Like you'll learn more about the field as you go. So I had mentioned a few ways to kind of look up like what are some of these skills that are required for different jobs. And there's really kind of two places you can start. I mean, more than that, but two that are pretty easy. One is occupational research sites. So ONET is one example of that. It's just onetonline.org. And I have a handout that I'll be providing everyone that has a link to that and a few other sites that you can utilize. And then another way to start is I would say go ahead and start looking at job boards now. So look at your Indeed, your LinkedIn, and things that are specific to your area, like maybe science careers or careers in tech or STEM. And look at some of those job descriptions, even if you're only a freshman or sophomore and you're not going to be applying for a full-time job for 2 or 3 years. If you start reading those job descriptions, I mean, that is the firsthand description of what we're looking for in a new candidate. That's the first hand description of here's what experience you need to matriculate into this job. So if you can see that as a freshman, sophomore, and can prepare for that, or just even familiar with that as a junior, senior, that's going to be huge. And one, determining is that something that sounds like you would like it? And then two, do you have the skill set and how can you plan to get the skills and experience that's going to make you successful for that role? So moving on to kind of like building some of that experience and developing a plan based on the things that you found, based on the things that you've learned, it's going to be really valuable to give yourself a little bit of accountability to make sure you're accomplishing things. It's a little bit, unfortunately, too easy to just kind of go through your college experience, which college is a lot of work for sure. That's definitely valid. But if you just graduate and you didn't do any of these other things that are on the board here, any internships or additional research or projects or anything like that, it could be a little bit difficult when you sit down to build your resume and realize, oh, I don't have a whole lot to put on here. So all experience is good experience. So if you're not totally sure what your end goal is, pretty much anything that you engage with will be really valuable. All the skill sets that you're developing are valuable and transferable. So if you're a chemistry student, for example, you don't have to be a chemist when you graduate. You could do any number of things that use those analytical transferable skills that you've been developing in your major, in your research, in your lab experience. So here are just a couple of examples of things that you can be doing freshman, sophomore, and then the next slide we'll look at junior, senior. You don't have to do every single item on here, and this is certainly not comprehensive, but something like this is a good little tool for you, just kind of make sure you're accomplishing the things you, in theory, should be accomplishing anyway. So, and they're kind of focused on those 4 career development areas. So your freshman year is kind of focused on exploring options. Even some of the try stuff items here, like the get volunteer hours or join a student organization, are kind of meant to give you a little bit more of an idea of what skills do you like to engage with. You'll also see that attend a job fair is on all of these. It'll be on all 4 sectors here. And the reason for that is that I would say a job fair is almost for a student less of a hiring event and more of a networking event, a chance to get to know people and ask questions. So it's a good career exploration event too. So don't be afraid to be talking to people and asking questions, because that's always going to be more powerful than just reading about a job. Until you've done something for 40 hours or, potentially just talk to someone really in depth about a job, it's really hard to know, like, what does that typical day look like? What does it really mean to do this for 40 to 60 hours a week? So those things will give you a better indication of that. You'll also see that informational interview pop up on the sophomore year checklist. And you can read at the bottom kind of what an informational interview is. And I would argue it is the most important thing you can do for your career development, no matter which of those 4 stages you're in. An informational interview, it sounds really formal, but really it's just a conversation with someone. It's where you reach out to an alum or someone who works at an organization you're interested in, or someone that you kind of got connected with, and you just say, hey, can you tell me a little about your job? Can you tell me about the organization that you work for? Do you have any tips for someone who's a current student? And that's going to be hugely, hugely valuable. One, because it is the start of that networking relationship, maybe even a mentor relationship. And networking, I think this is a good example, shouldn't be something that's kind of scary or seems disgenuine or super not introvert friendly. It's kind of just these intentional one-on-one genuine relationship building conversations. That's really a better way to think about networking than thinking about the golf courses and people in suits trying to get ahead of each other, or whatever conjures up when you think about networking. And you can see that sophomore year is kind of focused on developing skills. So again, kind of mapping to those 4 areas. Actually, there's a really cool statistic out there that while most just job applications, so if you just apply for a job that you see on Indeed or sciencecareers.org, most of them unfortunately won't lead to a job offer. Now, it's still worth your time. There's just a lot of people who apply to each one. But about 1 in 5 of those informational interviews leads to you knowing about a job offer or knowing about a way to get into an interview room. So about 1 in 5 actually lead to you building a real experience as an intern or getting that full-time job. So your junior year and senior year are going to be focused a little bit more on really building some more substantial experience so that your resume or CV are really ready for graduate school or professional employment. And then senior year especially will be focused on kind of making that transition. So knowing how to do an interview well, maybe knowing how to even negotiate a salary, knowing what a graduate assistantship is, figuring out all of those things, getting those timelines all in order. There's a little bit of hints on timeline for applying to most jobs in graduate schools. Typically, people will want to start a few months early, so before graduation when they're looking for a full-time job. And for most graduate programs, you apply kind of in that winter of your senior year. Now, I think there was someone on here who was interested in medical school. You'll probably be looking at that a little earlier. But that most just means that most programs kind of have that timeline of kind of winter of your senior year. Another skill that you can be developing, just kind of as an aside, is potentially learning additional things. So it's not on one of these timelines, but things are so accessible, like MOOCs, which are online courses, which most of which are free access. You can get apps to like learn a coding language. There's other resources online to learn coding or other either technical skills or transferable skills. You can develop those things, and also work with your career center or career office, because they probably have workshops and other ways to really help you flesh out what are your strengths, and then what are some good ways that you can be like looking for them and all these things that you're doing. So it's important to be aware of that, because when you're doing these experiences that we're talking about on these slides, you should be aware of where you're engaging with your analytical reasoning skills, your problem solving skills, your communication skills, because that's going to help you articulate that on the resume and the interview. So here on this slide are just a few examples of places you can build some experience. And maybe most of these are things that you've heard of. I think there's a few that are worth kind of pulling out. So if you wondered, how do you look for like an internship, for example? Again, I think reaching out to people and talking to people is a really good way to do that. Most internships that the students do aren't actually posted on a job site or internship site, although many of them are. That's a traditional way to look for an internship. But many times you reach out to an organization and you just say, hey, I'm interested in doing a project in this area, or I'm interested in an internship. Is there a way we can work together? So it kind of starts with that kind of networking, build your own internship engagement. And then, like I said, there are obviously internships that are posted on job sites and job boards and things. A lot of people are interested in research, and I would definitely recommend find a professor that you have a little bit of rapport with, maybe who's doing something that's interesting to you, and just say, do you need a research assistant this semester or in a coming semester? That's a really good way to build some of that research experience, and especially show academic preparedness for a graduate school, even if you might not be interested in research. Maybe more importantly, that's going to be a good letter of recommendation from that professor, probably. And it's never too early to start thinking about those. A few other things that are on here. I don't know if anyone has heard of REUs, which is Research Experience for Undergrads. That's through the National Science Foundation, and they have areas for all facets of STEM. So there's technology and computer science, there's engineering, and then there's your physics and chemistry and biology. So really good opportunities to do some really robust research if you're an undergraduate. And those are pretty easy to search. And again, I have kind of a link to that on the handout that I'll provide. A few of these other things I'll also include in that handout. So experience for STEM students, that's a place you can go and look for things through kind of federal experiences, and then some other summer learning programs and other things you can look at as well. And know that this isn't a comprehensive list. So I think we'll go ahead and move on from here and just kind of talk about a kind of rough college timeline. So many of us I know will be focused on graduate school. So I want to touch just a little bit on kind of what's evaluated for graduate school, and then what is the same and different about maybe what's evaluated for full-time employment. So on graduate school, there's really kind of four things that are assessed in your initial application. The first, as you can probably imagine, is your transcript or GPA. So they will look at this pretty holistically. So if you're a senior right now and you're doing really good this semester, but you had kind of a rough first semester, they will take that into consideration. But obviously, the better your cumulative is, the better that is kind of throughout, the better shape you're in. So if you're a freshman, definitely plan on having a decent transcript GPA by the time you move on to that next step. The next thing, so if you are wondering if your experience is evaluated, it is. So for pretty much any program, you will be required to put in a resume or CV. For those of you who might be going to medical school or professional school, you might be putting that into a more centralized application area rather than putting in a resume, but they'll still be evaluating your experience. So it could be your research experience or field experience, could be projects that you've worked on or papers that you've written. Typically, there won't be an expectation that you be published unless you're looking for a really big kind of Ivy League school. If you're applying to grad school at an MIT or Harvard or something, a publication will probably help. And it's always great if you can get your hands on one, but don't feel like you have to do one to get into graduate school at the undergraduate level. Next are exam scores. So for most graduate programs, that's going to be the GRE, which is just a general entrance exam. Know that subject test GREs are kind of phasing out. So there's like a chemistry, a biology, a psychology GRE that you can take. Most of those are supplemental if they're accepted or required at all. So most of you probably won't have to worry about those. I also usually give the caveat that while all of these areas are pretty equally evaluated by most admissions committees, depending on the program, they might put a little less weight into the GRE. So you definitely want to study for it. This is not permission to not study for it. It's a very long test and costs some scarce resources. It's about $200 to sit for it. So you definitely want to make it worth your time when you go in there to take that exam. However, if you're meeting those minimum requirements of the school, if your percentile is decent, you probably don't have to worry about that too terribly much. There'll be essays and statements, so a personal statement that explains your professional goals and why you're interested in this program. And there might be specific statements as well related to that school's mission statement or other specific prompts about why do you want to be a research chemist? Why do you want to go into pharmacology? And then finally, usually you'll need 3 letters of recommendation. So this is definitely something you can be focused on really early because it can be hard to retroactively think, who can I build a relationship with? Who could potentially go up to bat for me and write a good letter of recommendation for me? Are there any questions so far? I'm not seeing any in the chat yet, but I know graduate school tends to elicit some questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Fiona Dobson, and I just wanted to ask, when it comes to recommendations, does it have to be, whether it's for graduate school or med school or whatnot, do they have to be someone like in like the field you're trying to go into, or could it be like a professor you had in like a different field?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So thank you for that. I have kind of a couple answers. So the typical answer and then maybe a more specific answer. So one is you can always go into those applications and see if there's specific things that they're asking for. Typically what I've seen is they want at least one academic reference, maybe a professional reference or character reference, and then the third is kind of up to you. And some schools might only require 2 references. So if it were up to me, I would try to get maybe one person from your discipline or field who's a professor and can speak to your academic ability. But then the other 2 could be a little bit more interdisciplinary. So a lot of students that I work with will pick one person from their field, so a chemistry professor, a psychology professor, and then they might go with an honors professor or a professor they had for a core class even. And then their third person might be an internship supervisor or someone who isn't an academic individual at all. So you have a little bit of flexibility there usually in terms of who might be those letters of recommendation. But it is usually a good idea to get one academic source in your area, but they don't all 3 have to come from there the vast majority of the time. And again, for specific answers on that, you can always look at those applications and they might give you instruction, like please provide one academic reference, a character reference, and a professional reference, or just provide 3 references, in which case you can kind of pick whoever you want. Still might be a good idea to include a person from your field though. Any other questions? Okay, well, let's talk about how employment might be a little bit different, and then we'll have a little bit of time after that to go over some additional things or see if there's additional questions. So the employment process, the application really kind of starts with your resume. So your resume, and I put resume on here, not usually resume or CV. because the CV is typically only going to be for graduate school and academics. There's some exceptions to that. But for anything in industry, you're probably going to want to refine that into a resume. Those documents don't have to be super different, but it will probably be shorter, depending on what you're applying for, what you've done so far. And it will probably be more skill focused than just kind of like a list of things that you've done and projects you've worked on. You're going to want to focus on those skills. Also, I feel like I need to make sure I point this out. In spite of the image that I've used here, it's actually usually a bad idea to put a headshot on a resume. So I would not recommend doing that for most fields. The resume, the purpose of that, of course, is to get you a job, but you can think of it as a way to tell your story well enough to get you into the interview room. Once you're in the interview, the resume has largely served its purpose. You still want to know it like the back of your hand, and they'll be asking you about that and your experience. But once you're in the interview, it's been determined for the most part that you're qualified for that position. So you should feel pretty confident if you're in that interview room, and that should be a good perspective to have going in. They've determined that you're probably able to do this job. Otherwise, you wouldn't have made it this far. Again, if you can find someone to talk to, that's going to make it much easier to get into that interview room, because then you're a human in that equation, not just another piece of paper in the stack of papers. And the way you stand out there, if you're not able to make that human connection, or even if you do, is really by making it super obvious to the reader in only just a couple seconds that you have those skills in that job description. So remember what we talked about before, read those job descriptions very carefully and make sure your resume and interview, you're prepared to address the things they're talking about very, very specifically and poignantly. So after the interview, and there might be a couple rounds of interview, it might be a phone interview and then an in-person, or if you're a senior and you're interviewing soon, it might be over Zoom. After that, hopefully what will come will be an offer, an acceptance into that organization, an offer for a job. And then a lot of times people will ask about references, and your references are kind of part of that equation as well. From my experience, most employers will ask about references or call references after the interview, just to kind of touch base and make sure. But the perspective is usually you pick who your references are. So in theory, they're all going to be people who like you and have good things to say about you. So it's not always going to be a huge part of that evaluation process. I would say your biggest benefit from your references is if that's someone in industry who's influential. That's more of a networking resource than just a passive resource that you can put on your resume or CV or add into a references list. So make sure you're using them to get connected with other people that they might know, or asking them for advice. That's going to be where they're more powerful, I think. And then I would also like to point out, so what really gets you that job in spite of this process, or in addition and through this process, is really kind of what we've been talking about. It's the connections that you've made that's going to make things way easier and much more quick and fast-tracked for you. And then also the skills that you have. So especially in employment, skills are kind of the name of the game. That's really where we're at. What are those transferable skills? Are they the things that match this job? And then even for graduate school, so to bounce back just a little bit, making connections is super powerful. So if there's a graduate school you're really interested in, or a job that you're really interested in, I would definitely encourage you to find someone at that company, someone at that graduate school, and reach out and to say, I have some questions about this program. I have some questions about this kind of job. The earlier you do that, the better, but that's going to be hugely powerful in making a difference, especially if that's a job you really care about. Now, I always like to end with some action steps, and we have about 8 minutes here. So we will use that annotation tool again if we can find it, but I would like everyone to either annotate or just write down for your own records based on some of the stuff we've said today, maybe looking at that college timeline, maybe thinking about what's evaluated for graduate school or employment. I would be crazy not to fill in the blank. So what's something that you can accomplish this semester that you would like to kind of set as a goal, put on the board, or write down for your own record? So go ahead and annotate that if you could.
And I know some of you were struggling to annotate earlier, so if you could just feel free to put that in the chat as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jorge. So participate in a student organization. Thank you, Nicholas, for putting that in there. Get to know a professor, maybe intern or do research for them. Yeah, really good goal. Again, something that you can't do too early. Connect with professors and faculty. Great. Another huge advantage of faculty members at any university is universities tend to have those staff directories. So it's super easy to find someone's contact information, and potentially also super easy to find maybe their areas of research interest, depending on how much info that university puts on their like faculty staff page. Talk to a career coach. I'm a big advocate for that one. A lot of people will think of their career centers or career development offices as a placement or transition resource for seniors, but remember that was only one small piece of our career development model. So these things are really important to think about early too. Update your resume, apply to internships. Okay, so everyone has some action step items, so that's great. And then here's kind of your homework. So I fooled you. I'm going to make you do even more than that, or encourage you to do more than that. So one would be to complete your action step and then pick any two of the additional following things. Now, I put a couple resources in the Whova chat, but I'm going to put them in the Zoom chat here as well so that you can have access to them. Because a few of these action steps will pull from the things that are on that handout that I mentioned. So one, if you're wondering about just kind of some larger transferable skill areas, NACE is a organization that's done a lot of research and has some data-driven conclusions on what are kind of the 8 main skill areas that companies are looking for. Can you articulate? You have problem solving, communication, teamwork. These are things that are pretty intuitive, but this gives you some good vocabulary and definitions for what is that skill, and you can be looking for places you might be using it. So I would definitely encourage you to check that out if you're struggling with that kind of developed skills area, or you were in one of that quadrant that was like, I'm not sure what my skills are. This is a good place to go for some of those kind of like big picture transferable skills. And for many of you, you might be focusing on those technical skills too. So learn a coding language, or learn a lab instrumentation method or something in addition to what you might be learning for class. Especially coding, I think, will be the way of the future for everyone, maybe especially the STEM folks here. And then the other thing, let me pull that for you real quick, is the handout that I had mentioned. So this handout has a number of the things that we talked about today. It's got resources that are linked. So there are 3 career assessments on there. So if you're in kind of that explore options area, you can assess your interests, values, and personality. Your personality determines what energizes you. It determines how you react to different things. Your interests determine what engage you. So what things do you find interesting? What things make you feel like you're making a good difference? And then your values determine what kind of workplace is a good fit for you. What things will make you thrive and feel healthy and happy in a workplace. And you can find workplaces in any industry that meet different value areas. And when you know all 3, hopefully you have a good idea of what kinds of work will be really kind of driving to you and be really interesting to you. It also has some of those resources that I talked about. Know that they're not fully comprehensive. There's more than that out there. But if you're like a biology or natural resources student and you're looking for an internship, you'll probably find much more interesting results on the Student Conservation Association site than you will on Indeed, if you're looking for some of those posted positions. And there's a few others that we talked about too. There's some information on REUs and the National Science Foundation and how you might apply to those, or where you can go to look for some of those. And there's even some resources for like making the transition. And for any of this stuff, I would definitely recommend meet with your career coach or career advisor, or however your university organizes career services. For us, there's 2 different types of career centers. One is centralized, meaning they help all majors and all students. You might have a career center specific to like a STEM college or science majors or something like that. And then finally, I put my contact information on there as well. So whether you're a Ball State student or not, I know we have a few who are participating today. But whether you're a Ball State student or not, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, or if you want any additional information or resources on any of the stuff that we talked about today, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be sure to respond to you. And then that college timeline is on there as well. So if you wanted to use that for kind of a checklist, a way to hold yourself accountable for the next 4 years, the next year, or retroactively kind of go back and do some additional things. If you're a junior or senior, you can use that as well. So what questions do you have? I kind of gave you my overview here, and we have, well, I guess we are technically about out of time, but we have a nice break before the next keynote. So if anyone has any questions, I'm definitely more than happy to answer them.
Hi.
Well, if there are no questions, then,
Oh.
oh, sorry,
Yeah,
I cut
sorry.
someone off right when there was a question.
No, you're good. I put it in the chat, but I guess you didn't see that document
yeah.
or what you were talking about. Where can we access that?
Yeah, I just put it in the chat. It's also in the chat on the Whova app. So let me do that again just to make sure it pops up for everyone. Oh, I messaged it to the waiting room. So I am terribly sorry about that, everyone. You didn't see that. So here, let me fix that. Good. So there's two links there now. So the first one was the NACE skill areas that I mentioned, and the second one is the handout that has some of those additional links and resources and the college timeline.
Then Dylan, there's a question. It says, how difficult is it to get into graduate school or programs out of the US, specifically maybe Europe?
Yeah, that depends. So, I mean, Europe is a pretty interesting place for Americans. So a lot of them will kind of focus in that area. So some of them might be more competitive, but I would say it's going to depend maybe on like your skills and background. And that's an area that I would definitely recommend networking for. So in Europe, depending on what program you're looking at, they do graduate school a little bit differently. So you might be going straight into a PhD or terminal program, or it might be a different type of master's. So the first thing I would actually research is if you wanted to stay in Europe or come back to the United States after you were done, is that degree path something that's still going to work in the United States? Because sometimes even in these STEM areas, we find that a degree doesn't necessarily give you the same credentials from the eyes of an American academic that maybe the degree we're used to does. So you'd want to make sure that lines up with your career goal. And then it also might be that instead of applying to a specific program, you just need to find a dissertation advisor. You just need to find a thesis advisor and work with that person at the University of Wales or London or wherever you're interested in. So again, the power of networking and all of that would make that much easier to make that transition to a international graduate school experience. Doing an REU or something like that is also really powerful. So an REU will be in America. I believe all of those are domestic because it's National Science Foundation. But you will be working with a experienced doctoral advisor in that role, someone who maybe has worked with people at other universities and other parts of the world. Someone who could potentially end up being an advisor for you in the future. That's a phenomenal way to build that experience, but also like never forget about those connection opportunities that you get that you don't get when you're in a cloister of just being in the one school.
Krista says thank you. So Dylan gave us a lot of great resources, starting from the very beginning stage of let me know myself better. And as you progress, attending career fairs and then starting to network, doing the job search or grad school search. And so we're actually going to pick up on that Thursday. I know networking is scary, but it doesn't have to be. And so we're going to keep that momentum going. We are conducting myself just a 30-minute workshop on Thursday from 6:30 to 7 on keeping this momentum going. So like you're doing the conference right now. You've done research. Now what's next? And so we're going to talk about building that community for you on Thursday. Okay. So thank you so much, Dylan, for those awesome resources. And then I just want to let you know this is kind of the end of the session. So in roughly 30 minutes, 26 minutes, at 11 a.m. You're going to make your way over to Chasing Space. The right stuff is never give up stuff. Okay. So and that's with Leland Melvin for our afternoon keynote. And then the LSAMP alumni panel is at 12:10 p.m. So start posting those questions in the app to be answered. I'm just going to throw this out there. I was number 2 for ranking. So the more you engage, the more points you get. So feel free to keep posting those comments, posting those questions, getting engaged in the Whova app. So thank you all so much for joining us for today's session.
And I know I'm really looking forward to that keynote. So Melvin actually spoke at NACE one year. So the organization that came up with those skill competency areas. So small world, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you've been to space.